Today, we venture outside the world of Disney and Pixar and tap into something I love dearly, and that is the original Generation 1 of Pokemon. I've also just realized Gengar's not on, and that feels like the wrong thing right now. 1 second. Better. An iceberg takes a fandom and it goes through an iceberg and it divides it up into different levels, with some of the most known sort of rumors, legends, myths at the top of the iceberg, and the less known or maybe darker rumors, legends, and myths near the bottom. All right, starting at the very top, we're going to start with Pokemon Green. Here in the States, on September 28th, 1998, we got 2 Pokemon games published, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. We next got Pokemon Yellow, Special Edition Pikachu version. This released just over a year later, October 19th, 1999. And a truly a phenomenon, absolutely blew up. Pokemon was everywhere. I remember that I got, again, Pokemon Red as my very first Pokemon game. I remember that I got Pokemon Yellow for Christmas the next year. My dad hid it in a tin with dice in it so that when I shook it, it sounded like there was like dice moving around and I couldn't tell what was inside because he didn't want me to know that I was getting Pokemon Yellow. It was very sweet. However, in Japan, Pokemon Red and Blue were not the first games that were released. In fact, the first 2 games released were Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green. And then later that year, Pokemon Blue would be released on October 15th, 1996. And when I say it was definitely released on October 15th, 1996, I'm gonna tell you it definitely was not released on October 15th, 1996, even though that's what the internet will tell you. More to come about that later. And then finally, they would get Pokemon Yellow Special Pikachu version September 12th, 1998, which, as you might have noticed, is before we ever got Red and Blue. The reason I need to start here is not just so that we all know that there's a green version that exists out there. It's because a lot of what I'm going to reference today has to do with the fact that there are multiple versions that happened in Japan and that they are different than what happened in America. And so some of that just needs the context. Kanto is Kanto. The first area that the Pokemon games ever take place in is called Kanto. And it is widely known that these different areas within the Pokemon games are actually based on real places in the world. More specifically, Kanto is inspired by Kanto. They just took not just the name, but actually some of the geographical layouts are very similar. Some of the places are very similar. In the first Pokemon game, you might find the power plant. The power plant is the place where you can discover the legendary bird Zapdos. And it is believed that the Kanto power plant may be a reference to the Tokyo nuclear power plant, which is the first commercial nuclear power plant in Japan. And then you also might find later in the game the Kanto Safari Zone. And this may be a reference to a place called Mother Farm, which is an animal theme park located in Minami Boso Kwase National Park. Sorry if I'm absolutely butchering ththese names. This is also true of Lavender Town, Pokemon Tower, and all the different areas. Saffron City is related to Tokyo. Just pretty cool. A playground rumor, the Mew truck. Now, if you're not familiar, this is a Pokemon by the name of Mew. There are 151 Pokemon in the original release of Pokemon, and Mew is the 151st Pokemon. You never really saw Mew, although you did read about Mew in the game. There was a place called Cinnabar Mansion where you could find journal entries where you would read about the creation of a different Pokemon called Mewtwo. They were trying to clone Mew and that this scientist was working on the creating Mewtwo. But even as you finished the game, there was seemingly no way to encounter Mew. All of the other Pokemon were possible to encounter, but not Mew, which led to a lot of speculation that if we're going to tease this Pokemon in the game, then certainly there has to be a way to get Mew in the game, but nobody could find it. Some of you already know what I'm talking about, which is that the most famous playground rumor was that Mew was hidden under or in a truck that was next to a ship called the SS Anne. And you don't normally even access this area. You actually have to go out of your way to get to where the truck is. It's actually kind of a pain in the ass. But it was believed that if you could get to the truck and move the truck, that Mew was under the truck ? And we all just heard about this somewhere. This rumor is so ubiquitous that it has been referenced multiple times in Pokemon games. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the first remake of these games, if you went to where the truck was, you could find a hidden lava cookie, which is, by the way, not a Mew. That's not the only one, though. In Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu, if you go up to the truck, you can find a Revive under the truck. Again, not a Mew. And then in Pokemon Gale of Darkness, a non-Generation 1 game, a trainer says to you, there's no Pokemon under a truck. It's just so funny that it's like such a ubiquitous playground rumor that it got referenced in all these different games. But if you're worried that we couldn't get Mew in the games, hold that thought. For those of you that didn't play, I can't express to you how much everyone knew about the next two things that I'm going to tell you about. And again, I don't know where we learned it, but the first glitch that I'm going to tell you all about is MissingNo, or missing number. MissingNo is a glitch that appears in 5 different forms. Top left is the one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. It can also appear as a ghost. It can appear as an Aerodactyl fossil and a Kabutops fossil, which you would see in the museum. And then in the bottom right is the way that MissingNo would appear in Pokemon Yellow, because by that time there was color in the game. I just need to pause to tell you, there are many things I discovered in doing this research that I didn't know about this game. But what is very clear to me is that the code that holds this game together is such an absolute mess of spaghetti. So there are lots of things that can determine which version of MissingNo you would see. But one of them is the name that you chose at the beginning of the game. For instance, the Kabutops fossil, that's the bottom left one right here, will appear if W is the character in the 3rd, 5th, or 7th slot of your chosen name. What? Why? How does that happen? And you might ask, well, why do we care about MissingNo? Well, let me tell you. And that is that encountering MissingNo in a battle, specifically, it duplicates the items that are in the 6th spot of your backpack, multiplying them by 128. Once again, I don't know why. I'm sure this goes as no surprise that many of us use this as an opportunity to multiply things like Master Balls, which allowed us to catch any Pokemon instantly. Rare Candy, which allowed us to level up our Pokemon to 100 without trying. Nuggets, which sold for a lot of in-game money, so we could have infinite money glitch. I will just mention that by Yellow, they had fixed a lot of these problems. And actually, while MissingNo still exists in Yellow, encountering the one in Yellow will cause your game to freeze or get stuck. Now, how do you find MissingNo? A great question, which leads me to the final tier 1 item, the Old Man glitch. Even if you don't know the Old Man glitch, if you have played Pokemon, you have encountered the Old Man, because when you reach Viridian City for the first time, you're gonna find this guy laying on the ground, and he's blocking your path forward. By the way, this is just meant to keep you from progressing too far. You are supposed to take something back to Professor Oak. And so to make sure that you actually take the parcel back to Professor Oak, they keep you from moving on to Viridian Forest, right? Now, once you return the parcel to Professor Oak and you come back to Viridian City, he's no longer laying on the ground. However, he now serves as a tutorial. Now you're going to talk to the Old Man, and he is going to ask you if you are busy. And if you say no, he's going to offer to teach you how to catch a Pokemon. The Old Man's going to catch a Weedle. However, players would later discover that this Old Man served a very important purpose beyond being a tutorial, because we wanted to find MissingNo. Remember, I wanted the infinite money glitch, and the Old Man provided one of the easiest setups to get to MissingNo. Turns out if you talk to the Old Man and you have him teach you how to catch this Weedle, then you immediately fly to a place called Cinnabar Island. You get out of Pokemon, you surf along the coast, just like this. And when you surf along the coast just like this, you're gonna see MissingNo. Why does that work that way? I don't know. But it was incredibly consistent. Weirdly, even though they were made before, the Old Man glitch is not present in Japan's Pokemon Red, Green, or Blue. It only exists in Pokemon Red and Blue that was released internationally. And then by the time Yellow comes out, they removed it. But as an added bonus for you, I have another little localization change about the old man. That originally, the reason the old man was lying on the ground was that he was drunk, not that he needed his coffee. In the Japanese version, he says, I guess I was pretty drunk. My head hurts. Are you in a hurry? Whereas in the American version, he says, I've had my coffee now and I feel great. Sure you can go through. Are you in a hurry? Who knows? But that got changed. We're on to tier 2. As we get down deeper, there are going to be more glitches that maybe less people knew, or I didn't even know when I started looking at this, or things that are just sort of more specific stories, or the deeper we go, the darker things get too. But now we're going to talk about Pokemon Blue. Now, earlier, I told you all that Pokemon Blue was released on October 15th, 1996. And then I told you Pokemon Blue was definitely not released on October 15th, 1996. However, around October 15th, a comic called Koro Koro did arrive in mailboxes of subscribers. And Koro Koro, throughout Pokemon's launch, had been one of the main ways they were promoting the game. Fun fact, the first way they ever legitimately gave away Mew was through an issue of Koro Koro. Subscribers got an issue of Koro Koro and could apply to get a Mew. And for some people that got chosen, they sent in their game cartridge, and Game Freak, the developers of Pokemon, put Mew on the game cartridge and sent it back to them. So they used Koro Koro a ton for events and marketing. And this also goes for Pokemon Blue. So around October 15th, the November edition of Koro Koro arrives in mailboxes. And in this edition, as you can see on the cover, you can see Clefairy holding, maybe biting, a new cover of the game. This is the first introduction ever of Pokemon Blue. And it included in the comic an application form that readers had to mail in to purchase a copy of Pokemon Blue. And that application form had a set of instructions on it. So here are the instructions. Now, a couple of notes here. The application period goes from October 15th to December 27th. And these games were made to order. And the earliest anybody could expect to get a game, it was early December. So although you will hear online that the release date of Pokemon Blue is October 15th, that's just not true. While it might have been announced on October 15th in this magazine, the earliest anybody got it was December. The other strange thing about this, if we read these instructions, which are very cute, fill out the application, send it in, you get Pokemon Blue, then transfer the money to your post office after you've received the game. And you might notice there's no mention of any punishment if you don't do this. It is simply the honor system. Get the game, send us the money. Now, I imagine, because I understand how Japanese culture works, just a smidgen, that probably people paid for it. But it's certainly possible that many people got a free copy of Pokemon Blue. And then the final one says, hey, warning, the game is the same. But they did notice, and they put some of this, I'm going to talk about this in just a second, that they updated a lot of the art, and how often certain Pokemon showed up or what Pokemon showed up would be different from Red or Green. Now, this is the only way you could get this game. It actually doesn't go on retail until October of 1999, which is, long after we have it in the States. However, the existence of this game is going to be very important for our games moving forward, the Poke Gods. So after the game's released for us in Generation 1, the thing that you should now be picking up is that we are way behind the development of the games in Japan, which means that Japan was already working on the second generation of the games around the time that we're getting the first generation of the games, right? So while we get Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue and eventually Pokemon Yellow, the Japanese market is starting to get teasers of new Pokemon that are going to be available in the second generation of the games. But we didn't know that. We're not that far ahead. We've just gotten brand new games, and now we're seeing Pokemon that we don't know anything about. This led to a lot of rumors. It led to speculation that there was a group of, quote, Poke Gods that were incredibly powerful Pokemon that were secret within the world. Now, some of these Poke Gods never existed at all. Some of these were just totally made up. For instance, Ditto God. This was a completely made up evolution of a Pokemon called Nidoking, where they just took King off the back of his name and added God to it. And there was, there are all kinds of fake rumors of cheats and codes that you would need to use to obtain the Pokegods. For instance, Nidogod was rumored that you had to use an item called a Mist Stone. Doesn't exist. Completely fake. You had to get a level 100 Nidoking, Slowbro, and Nidoqueen in your party. Then you needed to defeat the Elite Four 2 times in a row and then use the Mist Stone, and Nidoking would turn into Nidogod. None of that is true. It's just something somebody made up. So in some instances, these Pokegods were just totally made up. However, some of the Pokemon actually were just things that we didn't know about yet, which is going to be the next 2 entries of this iceberg. The first one being Mew 3. While we were experiencing Generation 1, Pokemon the First movie was being produced. And in Pokemon the First movie, if you've ever seen it, you might know that this character makes an appearance. Now, this is just Mewtwo, but he has on armor. He has this armor on because people were trying to control Mewtwo, trying to control the most powerful Pokemon in the world. And so they use this armor to control the abilities of Mewtwo and use him for their desires, their wants, right? However, we first saw this character and it just looked like a really badass version of Mewtwo. And since Mewtwo is clearly the second version of Mew, then this really badass version of Mewtwo must be Mew 3. Now, notably, there's no confirmation of Mew 3 in the franchise. There's never been a Mew 3 Pokemon. However, once again, sometimes things, they spiral so far that what I really appreciate is that Pokemon will often take these things that come from the community and play with them a little bit, which is that in Pokemon Pocket Monster manga, the main character, whose name is Red's Clefairy, absorbs Mewtwo's DNA and transforms into a Mewtwo, dubbing himself Mew 3. I guess there is a Mew 3 after all. Another version that happened with the Pokegods was when next generation Pokemon started popping up, but we weren't familiar with them. And that is what happened with a character by the name of Peekablue. Now, this is a Pokemon named Meryl. You might notice that if you're not familiar with Meryl, I imagine you know Pikachu. And Meryl does in fact look like Pikachu. It looks a lot like Pikachu, except blue, which led to many of us when we first saw Meryl calling him Peekablue. And he was one of the Pokegods, right? That this would be the next form. Some of the Pokegods were not just badass, they were very cute. And Peekablue was thought to be one of these unobtainable Pokegods that was incredibly powerful. But it was just an actual Generation 2 Pokemon that was starting to be teased as Japan was preparing for the release of their next games, Silver and Gold. I have to be clear, this character's name was never Peekablue, all right? We called it Peekablue. Its official name, never Peekablue. But let me tell you what makes it harder to defend that is when Topps Trading Cards make cards for Pokemon the First movie and they reference this character as Peekablue. And it doesn't just happen once, it happens multiple times where they call it Peekablue. Notably, this isn't the only Pokemon that is misnamed here. The character in the front of this picture, his name is Snubble. He's called Buru in this text. Why is he called Buru? Who knows? Bill's garden. This home at the top of the screen is Bill's house. And behind Bill's house is a pathway that you could see, but you couldn't access it. And many players speculated that there's no reason to show us this pathway if it doesn't lead to something. And this started being called Bill's Garden. And it was believed that if you could get to behind Bill's house, to Bill's Garden, that there must be very powerful Pokemon back there. One of the prevailing rumors was that you could get all 3 starting Pokemon back there, Squirtle, Charmander, and Bulbasaur. There was no other way to obtain them. You couldn't catch them in the wild. Or perhaps more intriguing was that that's where the Pokegods were. The Pokegods were behind Bill's house. That's how you could get Mew 3. As it turns out, once cheats were used to access the area, much like the truck, there was just nothing there. Still no Pokegods, I guess. On to our next tier. We make it to our original sprites. Now, as I said, Red and Green released in Japan. And then before we ever got a version in the States, Blue released. And like I said, with the release of Blue, when they marketed it in Korokoro, they said we updated art in the game. They had gone and updated many sprites of Pokemon in the release of Pokemon Blue, which meant that by the time we got a version of Pokemon Red and Blue in the States, we didn't get the sprites that were in the original Red and Green version. We got the updated art that had come out from the made-to-order Blue version that had been released through Korokoro magazine, which means many of the Pokemon sprites that you may be familiar with from your Generation 1 are not the original Pokemon sprites that players in Japan saw when they played Red and Green. In the magazine, they actually teased some of the updated sprites here. But like I said, I do have a fondness for Gengar. This is the Pokemon Red and Blue Gengar. But had I played the very first Pokemon games ever, Pokemon Red and Green, released in Japan, Gengar would have looked like this, thick. He also looks like he's got some he looks furry a little bit. One of what I think is not a great sprite in Red and Blue is Ekans. However, if you played Red and Green, this is what Ekans would look like. This is what Ekans would look like. It's like they took a Bellsprout and they put a Bellsprout on the front of a snake. It's very confusing why he looks like that. And then, of course, I mentioned Mew earlier. Here's Mew. Now, Mew is actually, his sprite is in Red and Blue. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And so this is what Mew looks like. Pretty cute. This is the Mew that you may know and love if you ever got Mew in Pokemon Red and Blue. But if you saw Pokemon in Red and Green, this is what Mew would look like, which is different. You know, he kind of curled up there a little bit. Posture check for Mew there. However, I also have to call out that in a couple of notable cases, we got changed sprites that then appear to have changed back. So for instance, on the top, you have a Pokemon named Coughing. Now in Pokemon Red and Green, you can see Coughing's sprite on the left there. In the middle, you see our Coughing. This is the Coughing that existed in the Japanese Blue version, as well as our Red and Blue version. And then on the right, you see official Gen 1 artwork. So for whatever reason, for the updated art, they took Coughing's face and they put it under the skull and crossbones symbol, and then later they would just move it again. So Coughing now looks like original Coughing. And Cloyster is another example. In Red and Green, Cloyster is sort of vertical. In Blue and our Red and Blue, they flip him to be like horizontally laid out. And then in the official Gen 1 artwork, he's flipped vertical again, and he will go on to be vertical forever. Surfing Pikachu. Surfing Pikachu is a reference to Pikachu's Beach. Pikachu's Beach is a mini game that is exclusive to Pokemon Yellow. But even if you played Pokemon Yellow, you may have never seen this mini game before in your entire life. It's in that game. It's coded into Pokemon Yellow. If you have the cartridge, you have Pikachu's Beach. However, it's not quite that simple. You see, Pikachu's Beach can be accessed by going to the Summer Beach House on Route 19, and there's a surfing dude. But to access the game on the original game on Game Boy, you have to have a Pikachu that knows the ability Surf in your party. And there was no way in the game to teach your Pikachu the move Surf. You can't do it. The only way to get a Pikachu that knows the move Surf was either through an event distribution, like let's say they go, oh, you have to come to the Pokemon Center at this time, and then they would take your cartridge and add a Pikachu that knows Surf, right? Or if you played Pokemon Stadium, the N64 game, there was a way, if you connected your Pokemon Yellow to Pokemon Stadium, and then you battled with your Pikachu, there was a way that if you won the highest level of battling to teach your Pikachu Surf. But there's no way in Pokemon Yellow to get Surf on your Pikachu. Now, the good news is that the virtual console versions of Pokemon Yellow no longer require a Pikachu that knows Surf. You just need your Pikachu in the party and you can play it. But since I would imagine almost, if not none of you, have ever seen or played this game, I'll show you what it looked like. You would do sick tricks to get points. Why is he surfing backwards? A good question. White Hand. White Hand is a reference that a lot of people make to a specific line of dialogue that exists in Lavender Town, which is where the ghosts are in Pokemon. This girl that is outside of Lavender Town will ask you if you believe in ghosts. And if she says no, then she will say, "Teehee, of course, that white hand on your shoulder, it's not real." You know, just sort of building the like theme and vibe of a creepy town, but little fun payoff. Again, a lot of players really latched onto this. There's like creepypastas written about it. In the anime Pokemon Origins, which released in 2013, this dialogue was actually recreated. When the main character, Red, goes to Lavender Town, he similarly gets asked if he believes in ghosts, and he says, "No, not at all. I don't think they exist." But if you look closely, it's actually a white hand on his left shoulder they put in the anime, just as a little reference. Next up, we have capsule monsters. Now, originally, Pokemon was actually supposed to be called capsule monsters. When they were developing Pokemon, capsule monsters was the working name that they were using, but due to copyright issues, it had to be changed to pocket monsters. And if you're not sure why there might be copyright issues, in the 1960s show Ultraman, the hero uses, quote, capsule monsters stored inside, quote, monster balls, which he throws to release and battle kaiju. And here is an example of that from the show Ultraman. The dev team was heavily inspired by a lot of kaiju, a lot of manga, a lot of shows like Ultraman, and while they wanted their game to be called Capsule Monsters, unfortunately, due to copyright, it had to be changed. I like Pokemon. Pocket Monsters worked out for me. And our final entry on the third tier here is Venomoth / Butterfree. This is a reference to a theory that many players have had, that the designs of Venomoth, who is on the left, and Butterfree, who is on the right, were swapped at some point. And the reason why this theory exists is because this is a Pokemon by the name of Venonat. Venonat is a little bug Pokemon, and Venonat evolves, as you might imagine from the name, into Venomoth. And then you have Caterpie and Metapod, who evolve into Butterfree. But you might notice that if you look at Venonat and Butterfree, that there are some similarities. And you might notice that if you look at Caterpie and Metapod and Venomoth, that there are some similarities. And some people have taken it to, some extremes, pointing out the segmented bodies, facial protrusions, the eyes, the antennae, and there are a lot of similarities. Others have said that maybe, this decision, while they might look like each other, this decision might be that, young children are taught from an early age, caterpillars turn into butterflies. And so you can't have a caterpillar turned into a moth. They need to turn into a butterfly. Nothing, of course, is confirmed here, just sort of a fan theory. Now, speaking of Pokemon that sort of look similar to one another, Gengar is Clefable's shadow. Due to similarities in their design, this is Clefable on the left, and then of course that's my best boy Gengar on the right. And due to similarities in their design, it is theorized that Gengar is the shadow of a Clefable, or maybe the deceased ghost of a Clefable. And they sort of spiral on this, not just looking at the physical similarities, but also that in the first game, Clefable had normal type moves, and Gengar had ghost type moves. They actually can't affect each other. Normal type and ghost type can't do anything to each other. So this sort of made them feel like, oh, Clefable and Gengar are actually almost like mirrors of one another. However, I will just mention that Gengar's Pokedex entry reads that under a full moon, this Pokemon likes to mimic the shadows of people and laugh at their fright. So while we have no confirmation of anything, I would simply suggest that perhaps, at most, Gengar might be mimicking the shadow of a Clefable, but I think that's about where that stops. Next up, we have Uri Geller. This is a magician by the name of Uri Geller, and this is a Pokemon named Kadabra. In the year 2000, Uri Geller sued Nintendo because of the sale of its Kadabra Pokemon card, alleging that the company used his likeness to create the character. And this is because Geller is known for his spoon bending trick. But if that's all I told you, you might be like, yeah, sure, a lot of people bend spoons. Okay, I'll go you one step further. The Japanese name for the character is not Kadabra, it's Gengar. So he's definitely connected to Uri Geller. But that's actually not only true of Kadabra. The first stage of evolution for Kadabra is named Casey in Japan, which is named after the purported psychic Edgar Casey. And then Alakazam's Japanese name is Fudin, which is assumed to be an allusion to Houdini. So all of these characters are sort of references in their Japanese names to actual magicians. And actually, this had long-standing impacts to Pokemon, which is that as of 2003, once this case sort of got wrapped up, there were no more Kadabra cards ever made. Now, Kadabra continued to exist within the video games, but the trading cards specifically, and all the sets that would come out after 2003, Kadabra was not made because of this lawsuit with Uri Geller. This continued for 20 years. And in 2023, Uri Geller contacted Nintendo and released the ban. He's on the record saying that he had gotten like thousands upon thousands of email and fan mail asking him to please allow Nintendo to make more Kadabra cards. And so he decided to allow Nintendo to be released from ban. Now Kadabra cards can be made again. Catching Mew. Earlier, I said that people were looking everywhere under trucks to find Mew. And while players did desperately search for a way to find Mew in the game, an exploit was actually discovered pretty early on to find Mew via a glitch. Mew is actually included in the game at the very last minute as a prank. There was a feature, a debug feature that was in the game's code, and a lot of what caused many of these errors and these things to be in the game are that there wasn't a lot of room on Game Boy cartridges. They were very limited. There were actually like over 200 Pokemon at one point, and they had to cut it down because they didn't have enough room on the game cartridge to fit all the data. So at the last minute, they eliminated a debug feature that they thought they were gonna have to have, but it left just enough room in the game for one more Pokemon to be added. They hadn't planned on having Mew in the game at all, but at the very last minute, sort of as an inside joke, as a prank, one of the developers added Mew into the game. Nowhere to get Mew, but Mew was in the game. And their thought was like, one, this is just sort of funny, and if we decide to use it later for an event, like if we want to give it away through a magazine, it's in the game. But because it existed in the game, players discovered through a glitch that they could actually access that file and they could catch Mew. Basically, by pausing the game, the moment you walk into view of a trainer and then using an ability that makes you leave, like fly or teleport, you can make the game believe you should be in a battle, but you're not in a battle. And this ultimately allows you to manipulate the Pokemon you're going to see in the future. If you manipulate this correctly, you can reliably encounter Mew, which looks like this. But Mew is not the only Pokemon you can find. You can actually use this glitch to find any Pokemon in the game, including a level 1 Nidoking. Here's a Nidoking. Nidoking's pretty cool Pokemon. Big guy. He's also fully evolved. And you can find a level 1 Nidoking. That's pretty cool. And it's particularly pretty cool because you can do this glitch very early in the game. You can do it in Viridian Forest, which is one of the earliest areas of the game. Before you get to the first gym, before you ever fight Brock, you could have a Nidoking, a fully evolved Pokemon. But he's level 1, so you'd have to level him up, right? Brock's Pokemon are like level 10, level 12. You'd have to level him up, but pretty cool to find a Nidoking. That's a good Pokemon right there. But you know what's cooler than a level 1 Nidoking is a level 100 Nidoking. And due to the spaghetti code that I told you about earlier, if you catch the level 1 Nidoking and you level him up exactly one time, he doesn't go to level 2, he skips to level 100. Why? I don't know. Yoshi. What's Yoshi doing here? This is a Pokemon Iceberg. What are we doing talking about Yoshi? Nintendo Power included an article about how to find a very rare hidden Yoshi. All right, now here are the steps. Both players, 2 players, one with blue version, one with red version, needs to have beaten the game and have all 150 Pokemon. Once that is true, the blue version player trades the red version player for a Dratini. Then the blue version player evolves the Dratini to a Dragonite, then trades it back to the red version player. Then the red version player should head to the basement level of the unknown dungeon, be as close as possible to where Mewtwo was. Then you take a Firestone and you use it on Dragonite. Note, it's gonna say it's not available, but just do it anyway. The screen's gonna glitch and the Dragonite will evolve into Yoshi. And the Yoshi's gonna keep all the stats of Dragonite, but in the stats screen, it's gonna have Yoshi's picture on it with the ID number of 999. This is an April Fool's joke, it's not real. Apparently, one of these was not enough for Nintendo, because in the same year, on the official Nintendo website of Nintendo.com, there was an article talking about how to get Luigi as a Pokemon. Now, this is specifically how to get the Pokemon Lickitung to evolve into a Luigi. Now, in this picture, you can see Luigi would be a new type of Pokemon. His type would be Plumber. His special attacks were Wrench, Gas, Cower, Family Reunion, where he would summon Mario and Yoshi for a group attack. And then my least favorite attack, Mustache Slap. Let me tell you how much I don't like the idea of Luigi mustache slapping Pokemon. Now, if you thought that the directions to get Yoshi were complicated, let me tell you how you're gonna get a Luigi. First, you need to capture a Lickitung in an Ultra Ball. Then, you're gonna take the Lickitung to where Snorlax was blocking the bridge east of Vermilion City. Then, turn your Game Boy upside down. If the cartridge is not inverted, it will not work. Then you use a rare candy. If it doesn't work, it says this on the Nintendo article. If this doesn't work, shake your Game Boy up and down. Specifically, they say, do not shake it left and right. Shake it up and down. Then they write, obviously this is not accurate. Since the Skinny Plumber is Pokemon number 160, which you can see here in the graphic, we can't help but wonder what other Pokemon will pop up between 152 and 159. They're just leaving room open to do more of this. They said, why say he's 152 when we could say he's 160 and have room to work? And the final entry of this tier is Cubone's origin. Now, this is Cubone, if you're not familiar. And the entry of Cubone, what you learn about Cubone from his Pokedex is that Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother, which prompts the question, who is Cubone's mother? And so there have been many theories around what is the origin of Cubone. And for many people, one of the main theories is that Cubone is a baby Kangaskhan whose mother died. And so it wears her skull. And actually, you know what? If you compare the body, kind of like the Butterfree Venomoth situation, you can see some similarities, right? However, there's a secondary theory. People look at the skull that Cubone wears, and instead of thinking it looks like a Kangaskhan, they think it looks more like a Charizard. That this skull actually looks more like the head of a Charizard, which would mean that Cubone is actually a Charmander. And so in this theory, upon hatching, Charmanders rely on their mother to light their tails. Then this is crucial for growth and for imprinting, and that their mother's responsibility is to light the tail of a Charmander. And if a Charmander's mother died before lighting its tail, it might actually split from its evolution and put on the skull and become a Cubone. And now instead of being a fire-type Pokemon, it would be a ground-type Pokemon and evolve into Marowak. So you'd sort of have a split. Again, all, as MatPat would say, it's just a theory. It's sort of interesting to think about, especially since we don't actually know. All right, we are on to our next tier. Surf on gym statues. It's a short one. All I'll tell you is that in the game, there are statues in gyms, and for whatever reason, they behave like water tiles, which means you can both surf on top of them and fish in them. Then we have Zero B. It's technically called Zero B, but most commonly, people call this the Lost City. Now, this is a concept map from 1990 of what would become Kanto. And it's actually nearly identical to the release version. Here is what Kanto actually looks like. It's actually, like I said, almost exactly the same, except for this city. And so you might just say, oh, well, between concepting and creation of the map, it got thrown out. And that's totally fine. You would be correct, except that they kind of didn't eliminate the city. You see, while the town itself doesn't exist, there are no buildings you can go to. There is no place that you can go that represents this town in the game. There's still in the code references to this place. On the line 0B, much like every other town in this area, there's no reference to Pokemon that would appear. That's true of every town in the game. All of the routes in the game have references to what Pokemon appear in that area. Also, there's a flag on 0B that would be a reference to where you could fly to it, like every other town. And most notably, there is a store that is called out with what items you could buy and how much they would cost. All in the game's code, just left there. Invisible PC. Now this is in the game. This is a Pokemon Center. You go in to heal your Pokemon to be fighting fit. There's also, as you might notice, off to the right side, this is very important, take note of a computer. That computer is where you can trade out which Pokemon you want to be using in your party. You can store items, you can store Pokemon. It's very important. This computer is used all the time. We are going to go into a hotel. We're going to leave a Pokemon Center in Celadon City, and we're going to head over to the Celadon Hotel. Celadon Hotel is just one of the buildings you can visit in Celadon City, a very large, popular city in the Pokemon world where you can find all kinds of shopping. And inside, now you might notice that from right here, it looks awfully similar to a Pokemon Center, right? But notably, there's no computer, okay? No computer over here on the right side. This is a hotel. This is not a place where you might need to use a PC, except that there absolutely is a PC right here. Even though it is not visible in this hotel, because they just picked up a Pokemon Center and put it down and made it into a hotel, it's still coded that on this tile is a PC. So if you walk to where the PC is in a Pokemon Center and you hit the button, it'll just turn on a PC because it's still very much there and you can access it like you can any PC in a Pokemon Center. Nidorino's cry. Every Pokemon has a cry that they make when you encounter them or when you sort of hover over them in your Pokedex. And just to give you some examples, I'll let you hear a couple of cries, and then I'm going to let you hear the one that's most important. And you might notice that the evolutions kind of sound similar, often just tone-pitched down or up, but these are distinct cries that these different Pokemon make. Absolutely no one asked for this, but here's Electabuzz's cry. Yeah, it's just meh. Most importantly, what we need to hear right now is a Pokemon named Nidorina. Now, Nidoran was the first Pokemon that had gender in the game. You would encounter Nidoran female and Nidoran male, and they would then evolve into different Pokemon. Nidoran female would evolve into Nidorina and Nidoqueen, whereas Nidoran male would evolve into Nidorino and Nidoking. And so we need to hear the cries of a couple of these Pokemon, specifically Nidorina and Nidorino. So we're going to start with Nidoran female, and then it'll go through all of them, okay? That's Nidorina's. I'll play it again. That's it right there. Keep that in your head. Then we're going to go through Nidoqueen and then into Nidorino. They really just rise in pitch over time, with Nidoran female being the lowest in pitch and going higher as they evolve. So again, this is Nidorina's. All right. Then in the intro to Pokemon, when you first boot it up, you're going to be introduced to the world of Pokemon by Professor Oak. Notably, he's going to show you a Nidorino. However, when he shows you the Nidorino, it's going to play the cry of You can go back and forth and compare them. I certainly did just to confirm this, but the cry that plays when Nidorino, the male version of this Pokemon, shows on screen is the cry of Nidorina, the female version. There's nothing really more to this except to say how weird that they would just have the wrong sound play for their own Pokemon at the very beginning of the game. And our final entry for this tier of the Iceberg is Professor Oak Fight. Like they cut, a Mew was hidden, right? A whole Pokemon was hidden in the back of the code. A whole city was hidden. There are also 39 trainers that were hidden in the game that cannot be accessed. Most of them are not important. It's like random engineers and Pokemaniacs. But the most interesting of all is that in the code of the game is hidden a fight with Professor Oak. This was meant to be seemingly the kind of final boss of the game, and there were actually 3 versions of Professor Oak, because at the beginning of the game, you pick a starting Pokemon, and then your rival picks another Pokemon. So for instance, if you picked Squirtle, your rival picks Bulbasaur, because it will always pick the one that you are weak to. And then Professor Oak is coded to have the 3rd starter evolved all the way and leveled to level 69. Nice. And this is totally coded into the game. It's still there. You can access it using cheats or Game Shark. Why this got cut? Well, it's there. Just let me battle Professor Oak. On to our next tier. And we're going to get a little bit more obscure or dark as we go down from here. And the next one is Pokemon Pink. Actually, this wasn't discovered until 2020. In April of 2020, the Pokemon Yellow source code was leaked. And as players dug into the source code of Pokemon Yellow, they saw several brief references to Pokemon Pink, including the phrase Pocket Monsters Pink and Yellow. And many players speculate that this was supposed to be a paired version of Pokemon that was supposed to come out with Yellow. Much like Red and Blue or Red and Green, it would not just be Yellow, it would be Yellow and Pink, which then led to many people speculating that it would have a single starter. Like Pokemon Yellow only has you have Pikachu, who is your companion throughout the beginning of the game. Pokemon Pink might have a single starter as well. And one of the most popular theories is that that starter would be Jigglypuff. Because with Pokemon Yellow, they actually used the game to highlight the anime in a lot of ways. They made changes to the game to reflect the Pokemon anime, which had since been released. For instance, they made the characters of Brock and Misty look more like their anime versions. They changed Team Rocket to look like Jesse and James and have Meowth. And a lot of the anime versions of characters were paid off in Pokemon Yellow. Because of Jigglypuff's prominence in the anime, many people believe that they would take the anime version of Jigglypuff and make it your companion in Pokemon Pink. Others speculate that it would not be Jigglypuff, and it would instead be Clefairy. And this was mostly because there was a frame found in the Japanese release of the Game Boy camera that shows Pikachu and Clefairy together. And so people believe that this frame from the Game Boy camera was meant to reference the release of Pokemon Pink and Yellow. There's actually a lot to be said about the intended prominence of Clefairy, that early on, Clefairy was actually meant to be the icon of Pokemon, maybe to take the place of Pikachu. And so, who's to say? Buying Pokemon. There was a 1996 book, an official book called the Pokemon Pokedex that was released about 2 months after Red and Green were released. And in it, there were a lot of interviews with developers about creating Generation 1. And they talked about how originally they intended for you to be able to just buy Pokemon with money in the game. Actually, there are still some instances in the game that reference this. You can buy a Magikarp for 500 Pokédollars, or in the game corner, you can purchase a few Pokemon. Originally, this was going to be a full design. You were going to be able to buy more Pokemon for money throughout the game. It was actually even considered that if you had a trade with another person, it would evaluate how much your Pokemon were worth, and you might have to give your Pokemon plus some money to make up for the perceived value of these two Pokemon. They ultimately believed that this would have led to players focusing more on saving money than catching cool Pokemon, or that It might have given perceived value differences to certain Pokemon when they really just wanted Pokemon to, people to like what they liked. Also, they may just be saying that because what we learned is that they just couldn't figure out how to make it work in the trading system. And ultimately, that's why it doesn't exist, that if they could, they might have included it. Could have totally changed the game. Speaking of things that were cut from the game, in a 2018 interview with 3 of the devs from Red and Blue, it was mentioned that there was supposed to be an evolved form that came after Raichu. It was supposed to be called Gorochu, and they said it had fangs and horns and it looked like a god of thunder. Ultimately, this was scrapped because there wasn't enough cartridge space, like many things, and so it was scrapped. But they also said this wasn't just Gorochu, that there were many other 3-stage Pokemon lines that were scrapped as well, that there were supposed to be third evolutions for many of these different Pokemon that ultimately got truncated to 2 evolutions. There was a leaked gold and silver beta demo Pokedex that came out that had a bunch of baby Pokemon on it. And many of these baby Pokemon could have been some of these 3-stage evolutions that perhaps we were supposed to have an earlier evolution. And, it's hard to say, but one of the ones that may be the most likely is a Pokemon called Mikon. Mikon is baby Vulpix. And the reason why this might be the most likely is that actually in Vulpix's Pokedex entry in the first generation, it says at the time of birth, it has just one tail. The tail splits from its tip as it grows older. And you can see that Mikon seems to have had one tail that split from the tip into 3. Then by the time we get Vulpix, it has 6, and then it evolves into 9 tails. So, who's to say? It's all theory. And let's just keep up this trend as we talk about Gaoon. Gaoon was formally and officially referenced in a 2018 manga that was titled Satoshi Tajiri, the man who created Pokemon. Sort of a documentary manga, and it was Japan exclusive. And in it, it revealed that Gaoon was one of the very first Pokemon ever created. Now, in this photo, on the left, you see Rhydon. Rhydon has an index number of 0, alluding to perhaps that Rhydon was the very first Pokemon ever created. On the right, you have Kangaskhan with a number of 2. And then in the middle, you have a Pokemon that we have yet to see named Gaoon with the index number of 1, showing that this would have been one of the very first Pokemon ever created. Now, this is a fan mock-up of what Gaoon might have looked like. This is not official art. And if you are curious where the name Gaoon comes from, Gaoon is actually the Japanese word for the sound that Godzilla's roar makes. So that is where the name Gaoon comes from. And our final entry on this tier is original art scans. Now, if you have been a Pokemon fan for some time, if you grew up with these Pokemon games, you are probably familiar with some art of some of your favorite Pokemon that look a little bit like this. These original versions of art were found in the Pokemon Red and Blue Player's Guide. This came out in 1998. It was published by Nintendo Power, and it was exclusive to the West. And in the Pokemon Red and Blue Player's Guide, we saw art that looked like this. And you might have thought your whole life, maybe that's just the art style they were going for. It's really blown out, right? The colors are kind of weird. Some of the design is sort of strange here, but that's just the style of art. That was just what Pokemon looked like, maybe. That's certainly the Pokemon that we were introduced to in the West when this book was published by Nintendo Power, again in 1998. But recently, and when I say recently, I mean like 2023, original versions of this art, the original watercolors, have been discovered and are being compared to these scans that we got in 1998. And when I say that they are different, I mean they are really different. This is what the original Ditto art looked like. This is what the Nidoking art looks like. And, it is unclear why these images were edited or scanned like this, but the colors, of course, are in fact massively blown out. They were not intended to look like that. And in some instances, they literally edited. They didn't just change the color. It's not just a blown out color scan. They literally edited the pictures. So why they chose to edit the Pokemon and to completely blow out the coloring, I don't know. 2 tiers remain. And we start with Lieutenant Surge War. Lieutenant Surge War is a reference to, well, first, Lieutenant Surge. Lieutenant Surge is a gym leader in the first generation of Pokemon, and before a battle with Lieutenant Surge, he says, and I quote, "I tell you, kid, electric Pokemon saved me during the war. They zapped my enemies into paralysis, the same as I'll do to you." Which naturally prompts the question, what war did Lieutenant Surge fight in? Now, there are many versions of this. Some suggest that there's a theoretical Kanto War that happened before the events of Red and Blue, which may answer questions like, why do you and your rival not have dads? Or why are most people in Kanto either very young or very old, and kind of not a lot of people in between? Other people suggest that because Surge's title is the Lightning American, and Red and Blue specifically reference real world places or events like the Eiffel Tower, the Space Shuttle Columbia, that Surge was meant to just be an American occupant of Japan, and that possibly he fought in a real war like Desert Storm, for instance. Since these games, the Pokemon games no longer make direct reference to real places and events. And then, finally, others still theorize that while Surge says that Pokemon saved him in the war, perhaps he didn't fight in any wars at all. He's just a fraud, lying about his background and a supposed war that he fought in so that he looks cool. Because while Surge is a gym leader that fought in a, quote, war, he is also next to other gym leaders like Sabrina, who's a literal psychic, Giovanni, who's a crime boss, Koga, who's a ninja. So perhaps he's just lying about being a soldier because he wants to look cool. Who knows? You think those theories are ludicrous? How about different theories? Onyx is a water stone. Now, on the left here, we have some evolution stones. We have water, leaf, thunder, flyer, and moonstones. And there are lots of ways to evolve your Pokemon. We talked about trading a little bit earlier. Some Pokemon, like Gengar actually, is evolved by trading. This was to promote trading Pokemon. Evolution stones are another way that Pokemon are evolved. Some Pokemon will not just evolve when they level up, they have to be given an evolution stone. Pokemon like Pikachu evolves into Raichu when he is given a Thunderstone. Or Clefairy, who we talked about earlier, evolves into Clefable when they are given a Moonstone. And so there are many different versions of evolution stones. This one is what we're going to talk about right now. So on the left, we have a Water Stone. And on the right, we have Onyx. And Onyx is a Water Stone. So, like I said, some Pokemon need evolution stones to evolve. For instance, here is Staryu. Staryu needs a Water Stone to evolve into Starmie. Except Staryu doesn't actually need a Water Stone to evolve into Starmie because Onyx is a Water Stone. And I know I'm just kind of being ridiculous right now because what I'm about to tell you is ridiculous. Which is to say that you don't actually need to give Staryu a Water Stone to evolve. All you need to do is have Staryu in a party with an Onyx. The game's code thinks that an Onyx is a Water Stone. And so if Staryu is in your party and levels up one time while there's an Onyx in it, it will just evolve. And this isn't only true for Onyx because Executor is a Moonstone and Psyduck is a Leaf Stone because for whatever reason, the game's code thinks that an Executor is the same thing as a Moonstone, and the game's code thinks that a Psyduck is the same thing as a Leaf Stone. And so if you have a Clefairy in your party that needs to be given a Moonstone, you don't have to give Clefairy a Moonstone. You just need to level up Clefairy while it's in a group with an executor, and it will just evolve as if you gave it a moonstone because the game thinks you gave it a moonstone. What is wrong with the code of this game? Next up we have Mr. Mime is Ash's dad. What? Well, first let me introduce you to Ash's mom. She's been around since the very beginning, the earliest episodes. When Ash has to get up, he's late to go get his starter Pokemon, ultimately resulting in him getting Pikachu. We immediately meet Ash's mom. She comes and gives him all the supplies that he might need to be successful on the road to Viridian City. However, we never meet Ash's dad, perhaps because of a Great Kanto War that Lieutenant Surge fought in. Or perhaps I posit a different theory to you, because there is something I know about Pokemon, and that is that Pokemon fight other Pokemon. All right, I feel confident about saying that. In fact, I know from a dev interview that at one point they thought about having humans fight Pokemon. They thought, well, if humans are going to fight Pokemon, then why do we even have Pokemon, right? We need Pokemon to fight Pokemon. And so what I say with great certainty is that humans don't fight Pokemon. Pokemon fight Pokemon. And then I will say another thing I know with great certainty is that Spearow attacked Ash. And so I posit to you, dear listener, if Pokemon don't fight humans and humans don't fight Pokemon, then I ask you, why did Spearow, a Pokemon, attack Ash, a human? ? Is it possible that Ash is not entirely human? Ash is maybe a Pokemon! Because instead of Ash's dad being somebody that went off to the Great War at Kanto, perhaps Ash's dad is a Pokemon that we know from his relationship with Ash's mom, Mr. Mime. And I submit to you some evidence of a relationship between Mr. Mime, a human-looking Pokemon, and Ash's mom, which is, look at that hand on her thigh. I rest my case. Ditto is a Mew clone. Now, Ditto, if you are not familiar, has the ability to turn into every other Pokemon, and then it can use whatever powers that Pokemon knows. Which is to say, if I were to shortcut that, I would just say, Ditto can use all of the abilities. Now, it might have to turn into a Pokemon first, but it can perfectly mimic any Pokemon. Now, unrelated, I'm sure. On the right, we have Mew. Mew is the genetic beginning of all Pokemon. Mew has the DNA of all Pokemon within it. And Mew is the only Pokemon in our first generation that can learn every single ability that every other Pokemon can learn. So again, if I were to just shortcut what I just said, Mew can use every power because it has the DNA of every Pokemon. Ditto can turn into every Pokemon and can use every power that that Pokemon knows. I'm sure those two things aren't connected at all. A couple other things I just want to point out that I'm sure are complete coincidence is that both these Pokemon happen to be 4 kilograms in weight. Also, something I just want to point out is that Ditto can be found in the first generation in the Pokemon Mansion. I mentioned the Pokemon Mansion earlier, that players learned about Mew because of journal entries in the Pokemon Mansion. That amongst the rubble and wreckage of the mansion are journal entries that they're written by the scientists who obtained a Mew and cloned it to create Mewtwo, a process that I'm sure was very difficult. Cloning a Pokemon as intricate as Mew, making a new species, I'm sure that was quite hard to get that right. I imagine there were many failures along the way. I also I'm sure for things that are completely unrelated, would want to point out that the normal and shiny versions of Mew use very similar coloring, with the normal version of Ditto being kind of a pink purpley color, the normal version of Mew being a pink color, and then the shiny version of Ditto being a light blue color, with the shiny version of Mew being a light blue color as well. So the theory is that Ditto exists because it is all of the failed clones of Mew while trying to create Mewtwo. Now, in a 2016 interview, not to ruin anything, Junichi Musada, who's the director of Pokemon, debunked this theory by saying the unique thing about Ditto is that it's a Pokemon that can change forms, but all the Pokemon we create are with unique elements, so we just make sure they're all individual life forms. He said, definitely not true, unless he's lying. Next up, we have Blue's Raticate. Blue, if you're not familiar, is your rival. You fight your rival multiple times throughout the game, and his party changes throughout what Pokemon he has. Like I said, You pick your starting Pokemon first. He will always pick the starting Pokemon that is strongest against yours. But in the third fight, you fight him many times throughout the game. In the third encounter with your rival, you will notice he has a Pokemon by the name of Rattata in his party. It's a level 15 Pokemon. And by the way, this is true regardless of what starter Pokemon you pick. The only Pokemon that changes is that starter Pokemon. His other Pokemon remain the same. And then in the fourth encounter with Blue, you encounter him on the SS Anne, that cruise ship I talked about earlier with the truck, right? And in this encounter, he has Raticate. His Rattata has evolved. It's one level higher, it's leveled up to level 16, and it has evolved. However, before the fifth rival battle, things change a little bit because the fifth time you encounter Blue is in a place called Pokemon Tower. Now, I mentioned Pokemon Tower earlier as it is one of the main icons of a place called Lavender Town, known for it being a little bit spooky, for it having some ghosts in it. And Lavender Tower is where you will find the graves of where people bring their Pokemon to be buried. When you encounter Blue here, you find him standing near a grave. And when you run into him, he says, "Hey, what brings you here? Your Pokemon don't look dead," implying that the only reason why somebody would be in Pokemon Tower standing near a gravestone would be that one of their Pokemon has died. And then he battles you. I'm sure overtaken by emotion. He battles you, threatening to make your Pokemon faint. And you might notice that in this battle, he no longer has a Raticate. Now, some would say this is simply because the Raticate got boxed. He swapped it out, chose to use a different Pokemon. I would argue that a party can have 6 Pokemon. Blue only has 5. So why would you box a Raticate when you have room for it in your party? You didn't replace it. There's not a new Pokemon taking up the 6th slot. Did the Raticate die? Is Blue here paying respects to his lost Pokemon? Is that why he asked why you're here? Who's to say? And that brings us to the final tier of our iceberg. Starting off, we're going to stay in Lavender Town for Lavender Town Syndrome. Lavender Town Syndrome is a creepypasta rumor that, just for the record, is not based in fact at all, that said that the Lavender Town theme, I should play the Lavender Town theme, an icon. So the Lavender Town Syndrome is a creepypasta rumor, not based in fact at all, that said that the Lavender Town theme included extremely high frequencies that only children and young teens could hear due to their ears being more sensitive. And due to these frequencies, illness and severe depression spread across these teens, often making them act irrationally or complaining of severe headaches. Now, again, this is just not true. There's no basis of fact in this at all, but it is a creepypasta rumor that spread. And then around 2010, new videos popped up on YouTube where somebody used a spectrogram to analyze the Lavender Town theme. And what they found might surprise you, because by using this definitely real analysis, they were able to look into the sound waves of the Lavender Town theme, and they found that it made spooky images like that of a ghost or these unknown Pokemon. Now, if you're not familiar, the unknown are a Pokemon that would pop up in Generation 2, and there's one for each letter of the alphabet, which means that you could decipher the message that is in the sound of the Lavender Town. And if you were to decipher it, if you were to translate what's picked up in the sound of the theme itself, it says, "Leave now." Creepy indeed. Anyway, not based on any kind of fact, but but now let's talk about things that are actually not good. Not just theoretically not good, actually not good, having to do with Pokemon. And the first one is to talk about a Burger King promotion. Now, I'm sure some of you all remember this. The year is 1999. Pokemon the first movie's coming out, and Burger King releases a set of 59 toys. They're going to say 57 in the promotion, but that's just because 3 of them are like variations of the same toy. They also release, as you might know, 6 23-karat gold-plated cards that you could buy at the Burger King. They're pictured there on the right. This promotion was so popular that Burger King actually ran full-page newspaper ads apologizing for shortages of the toys because so many people wanted them and they were running out of them. And so many people bought them. This ran from November through December as, again, part of this promotion. Tragically, this is no joke, tragically, that December, there were multiple instances of suffocation due to half of the container, the Pokeball container, being stuck over the nose and mouth. All of the toys came in one of these, and they would break open in half to reveal what toy you got, and half of the container got stuck covering the nose and mouth, which led to, tragically, multiple instances of suffocation. This also led to a website being published titled Pokemon Kills and a mass recall of these toys. Adults were urged by Burger King to discard or return both pieces of the toy. And not to make light of a tragic event, I couldn't help but laugh at this part that I read, which was customers were encouraged to return the toy, and they were, quote, given a small order of French fries in return. What? It being an incredibly dangerous thing to have in your home is not enough incentive. If you bring it back to us, we'll give you small French fries. That makes it better, right? Next up, we have holiday hijinks. And to talk about holiday hijinks, I have to introduce you to Jinx, the, quote, yes, this is in the Pokedex, human shape Pokemon. Sorry, I shouldn't introduce you to this Jinx. I should introduce you to Jinx. This is the version of Jinx that was released with Generation 1 of Pokemon. Here she is in all of her glory. You should also note that not only was Jinx called the, quote, human shape Pokemon, the Generation 1 Pokedex of Jinx says that, quote, seductively wiggles its hips as it walks and, quote, talks in a strange, incomprehensible language. Now, this is going to be important because on January 5th of the year 2000, a few weeks after an episode of the anime came out on television titled Holiday Hijinks, which prominently featured this Pokemon, Jinx. An article was published by a writer named Carol Boston Weatherford called Politically Incorrect Pokemon. I'm going to quote Carol Weatherford. I saw a character on the Pokemon TV cartoon that not only stripped the phenomenon of its innocence, but stopped me cold. The character Jinx, Pokemon 124, has decidedly human features. Jet black skin, huge pink lips, gaping eyes, a straight blonde mane, and a full figure, complete with cleavage and wiggly hips. Put another way, Jinx resembles an overweight drag queen incarnation of Little Black Sambo, a racist stereotype from a children's book long ago purged from libraries. This article was published again on January 5th of 2000, and it went mega viral. It went viral and caught enough steam. It started a conversation enough that the anime episodes featuring Jinx were edited in the international market, and at least 2 episodes of the anime were prevented from airing altogether. Now, additionally, changes were made to Jinx's design. Gold and Silver, the second generation of Pokemon, released in Japan in 1999, which is before this episode airs and before this article is published. However, they went a year of localization before they released in America, which means that there was time between when this happened and Gold and Silver releasing in America, which means that the sprites were updated. So now you can see the original artwork is on the left. The top is what Jinx released looking like in Japanese Gold and Silver, again in 1999, before this article is published. And then in 2000, when it releases in America, they've changed Jinx to have purple skin. Notably, the Gold and Silver cartridges, they maxed out at 2 colors for any Pokemon. So by making Jinx's skin purple, they had to remove the blonde from her hair. And now Jinx's skin has been made purple. And from then on, Jinx was always depicted this way, even in Japan. The modern version of Jinx is still depicted this way. You likely will not see anime episodes featuring this character. Still very much a part of the games, but Jinx has been edited out of pretty much every anime episode they were featured in, and you would likely not see one in another anime episode in the future. And that leads me to our final entry, which also has to do with the anime, called Pokemon Shock. Pokemon Shock is a reference to an episode which in English has been translated to Computer Warrior Porygon, but is more commonly known as Electric Soldier Porygon. This is the 38th episode of the Pokemon anime first season, and it only aired one time. During its sole broadcast in Japan on December 16th, 1997, there was a scene with flashing lights because there were a bunch of missiles and Pikachu used electricity to stop the missiles. And there's this scene with flashing lights from the electric shock of Pikachu that induced photosensitive epileptic seizures in children across the country of Japan. Over 600 children were taken to hospitals. And this incident is referred to in Japan as the, quote, Pokemon Shock. After this incident happens, the anime went into a 4-month hiatus where they were not on the air. This episode was pulled from rotation and it was never aired again. It was never aired in any other country. It was never again aired in Japan. It was never aired. This has sparked some controversy and conversation because of the stigma around this episode and the title character featured in it, Porygon, the Pokemon you see on your screen right now, has not been featured in the anime since, even though the effect was caused by Pikachu, not caused by Porygon at all, because the title of the episode featured Porygon, and it's known as the episode that featured Porygon. Porygon has never been featured again because of this instance with this episode. Now, again, not to make light of a horribly tragic event that is very well known within the Pokemon history, but I had to laugh when I read that the following day, the stock price for Nintendo dropped. It dropped like 4% because of this instance happening. And the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had a press conference, and they said that the video game company Nintendo was not responsible because the original Pokemon game for its Game Boy product was, quote, presented in black and white. We're not responsible. Our video game is in black and white. That was in color. We had nothing to do with it. Which, I mean, obviously, like, they didn't animate the television. It's just such a crazy thing to say. Is like, guys, the Game Boy's in black and white. Obviously, we didn't cause the seizures. Ironically, the episode that was supposed to follow Electric Soldier Porygon was episode 39 of the Pokemon anime. None other than Regulus Christmas, or as we know it in America, Holiday Hijinks. And that is going to be the end of this Pokemon Generation 1 Iceberg.